Welcome, everyone. Thank you for attending our Leverage Conference. This is the second in our three-part Hope Conference series, and our themes today are creating a collective community, looking through the lens of diversity, and success stories and lessons learned. I am your moderator, Kim Slade, and I will be moderating our main stage events today. If you have questions during today's session, you can enter your questions in the Q&A at the bottom of the broadcast screen. To start, Abuse Hurts would like to acknowledge the land on which our building is housed and where our employees, volunteers, and members of the public gather. This land is the traditional territory of the Mississaugas, the Haudenosaunee, the Anishinaabe-Waukee, and the Wendake-Neowensio. We are guests on this land, and it is our shared responsibility to respect, honor, and sustain the land. We acknowledge this land out of respect for the Indigenous nations who have cared for Turtle Island, also called North America. As we are all attending today from different regions across Canada, we encourage you to learn about the lands on which you reside and to develop a deeper understanding of the Indigenous nations in your area. You can do this by visiting the lobby, searching the map located in the land acknowledgement announcement. We would also like to thank our project funder, Women and Gender Equity Canada, who's made this conference series possible. And we would like to thank Seneca College for sponsoring this conference event. All of our sessions today are being recorded and will be able to be viewed following the conference by visiting a conference link that will be sent out to all participants. Now, to start, I would like to introduce our first speaker of the day, Jessica Williams. Jessica is the chair of the Abuse Hurts Board of Directors. She has over 20 years of management experience and is a diligent proponent of excellence in all business practices. She carries a wealth of knowledge and experience in wealth management, marketing, customer service in both profit and not-for-profit sectors. Jessica is passionate about the Abuse Hurts mandate and is delighted to be here today to share opening remarks. Welcome, Jessica.
Thank you so much, Kim, and thank you everybody here for joining us live on this wonderful Tuesday. It is a great privilege to be here as part of the Abuse Hurts team, and I want to welcome you all again to Leverage, which Kim had mentioned is the second installment in our three-part Hope Conference series, Breaking Silence, Building Communities. And this is the next phase of what we'd like to do with our initiative. Again, we're so glad that you were able to be here and join us for this important initiative. And it wouldn't be possible without, of course, all of you, our incredible lineup of speakers, our funder, as Kim said, Women and Gender Equity Canada, and last but certainly not least, our incredible conference team and tech team that have invested their heart, their soul, and their passion into bringing this series to life. I would also like to especially appreciate Seneca College, who is our sponsor for today's event, and we are delighted to collaborate with Seneca in our shared pursuits to raise awareness against abuse. It is also a great honor to share with you all today that Seneca College has just launched a new micro-credential in anti-human trafficking advocacy and awareness. You can learn more about that credentialing program in the exhibitor booth, which can be found in our exhibit hall. And on that note, that brings me just to a few quick housekeeping issues and items before we begin. This virtual platform that we are streaming live to you is called FeedLoop, and we're grateful for this amazing platform that you can navigate by accessing the blue bar on the left side of your screen. There is your navigation map for getting around inside the virtual event to the various sessions and also our networking and exhibit hall. The blue vertical bar is your go-to place. And if you want a brief tutorial video on how to get the most out of your virtual conference experience, then I welcome you to click on the bottom where it says help. There is a really quick video on just simple navigation tools for your interest. Also, to access the speaker sessions, which will be happening live throughout the day, on the session tab on your left blue bar, you will be able to click in there and see what sessions are running at what time. You'll notice a live red button. So please be sure that you are in the right stream and attending the right session you want, but otherwise you can go and select which one is available. During the breaks, be sure to visit our exhibit hall. As I referred to, we have a lot of vendors available in there with subject matter, material, resources, as well as the Abuse Hurts booth, which you can learn more about some of our initiatives and what we're up to. Also, some conference slides and materials and resources from any of our speakers. I would also encourage you to visit our chat on the right side of your screen. Kaylee is one of the team members here that will be available to answer any questions. If you're having trouble navigating or finding a particular place, please feel free to chat with her. Also visit the network booth where you can collaborate and introduce yourself to other guests and attendees. And also, I encourage you to visit the photo booth and please post on our wall your name, your selfie, where you're from, what agency you're representing, just so we can get to learn a little bit more about you, since unfortunately we're not in person. As Kim mentioned, today's replays will be available by logging into the conference site. So I would encourage you to contact any of your colleagues, your friends, your partners who haven't maybe had a chance to register. As long as they register for the conference before the end of the day, they will have access to the replay. So maybe their schedule couldn't permit them to be with us live, but we don't want to have them miss out on the replays that are available. So please encourage them to sign in. Our opening speaker will be coming up in just a moment. And as I said as well, our question and answers will be available in each of our sessions. There is a dedicated Q&A box in the live presentation window that you can type your questions in, and be sure it's in that dedicated Q&A box so that the moderators will be able to see your questions. Be sure to watch the lobby bulletin board for announcements on what sessions are beginning. And again, stop by our Abuse Hurts booth for any resources or access to the slides from any of our speakers. And in general, as I represent the board of directors, the conference team, the staff, and the volunteers here at Abuse Hurts, it is a privilege to be aligned with the initiative of ending abuse everywhere. Abuse impacts everyone, whether we are aware of it or not. And as a society and as a people within our communities, we all bear a responsibility for changing the course of the future by courageously and compassionately unmasking the ways that abuse has victimized our most vulnerable members of our communities. Learning how we can collectively build a culture of non-tolerance and prevention is one of our principal mandates. It is with this mandate that I want to articulate the honor and privilege that we have here at Abuse Hurts in curating such a powerful and influential collective of survivors and experts willing to tackle the enormous topic of early detection and prevention of intimate partner violence and interpersonal violence. Understanding the need for strategic alliances and partnerships with experts and survivors who are willing to share and offer their insights and strategies to help us break down stereotypes and build bridges within our communities is essential. To bring the kind of change necessary, it is certainly not something we can do alone. But we are all here to learn more about how we can become more effective and grow together to bridge our gaps and to bring change to the cultural landscape in our nation. We recognize that this is a great responsibility, and we're eager to connect and be connected with many more people who share our similar passion and pursuit to see the end of abuse. Our first installment, Learn, we tackled hard questions of what causes silence and what are the forms of abuse that maybe we are not aware of. We learned so many things, and we expect no less with our Leverage Conference today. We recognize that in order to effectively build upon the great work that others have gone before us to achieve, we have to have an understanding of how these groups have worked together to build communities and exploit joint problem-solving strategies. We want to encourage everyone to look at our very own communities through different lenses and offer the diversity that we deserve so that we can foster a more expansive and inclusive culture of hope. Today, we will hear from a number of success stories and perspectives that will broaden our understanding of how we can leverage existing strategies to help shift the social and cultural landscape of abuse. We want to bring a new lens on how society sees and perceives abuse, how we talk about abuse, and more importantly, how we can move the needle on early detection and prevention of abuse, all while creating a safe and supportive way to honor survivors for their bravery and courage. Each one of our speakers today have dedicated their lives to this common theme, and it is my pleasure to introduce our first keynote speaker of the day, Detective Inspector Shelley Tarnowski from the Ontario Provincial Police. She will be speaking about building capacity through community partnerships. We will open up our session at the end for Q&A, and so just a reminder to please use the Q&A box in the bottom of the broadcast window. Detective Inspector Shelley Tarnowski has been a police officer with the Ontario Provincial Police for 29 years, beginning her career in the Caledon Detachment as a uniformed patrol officer. In 1997, Shelley was assigned to assist with the implementation of the first OPP Regional Sexual Assault and Child Abuse Investigation Unit. 2 years later, she assumed the role of Regional Abuse Issues Coordinator for the Greater Toronto Region. During her tenure as the regional coordinator, Shelley was instrumental in developing the first domestic violence, sexual assault, and child abuse protocols for Peel Region and Dufferin County. In 2001, Shelley spearheaded a campaign to develop the Sunrise Center, a sexual assault and domestic violence care and treatment center at Headwaters Healthcare Center in Orangeville, Ontario. In addition to her time in the Abuse Issues Unit, Shelley was assigned for 2 years to the Regional Crime Unit, followed by an 18-month secondment to the Criminal Investigations Branch as a lead investigator on a 35-year-old historical homicide. From 2005 to 2007, Shelley was assigned as an investigator with the Professional Standards Bureau. And from 2007 to 2015, Shelley was assigned as the Provincial Coordinator of Abuse Issues for the Ontario Provincial Police, which included coordination of province-wide response to domestic violence, sexual abuse, child abuse, human trafficking, and victim issues. Shelley was subsequently assigned as the manager of the Ontario Sex Offender Registry, which is an investigative tool for law enforcement to monitor and track convicted sex offenders. She is currently seconded to Ministry of the Solicitor General, Public Safety Division as the Director of Ontario Major Case Management. In 2012, Shelley was awarded the Queen Elizabeth II Diamond Jubilee Medal for her dedication and long-term work in the area of abuse awareness and prevention. In 2014, she was the recipient of the Ontario Public Service Ministry of Community Safety and Correctional Services Ovation Award for partnerships and collaboration in community safety. It is again my pleasure to introduce and welcome Detective Inspector Tarnowski.
Thank you very much, Jessica. It's my privilege to be asked to speak at today's conference series and just to be given some time in this space. I won't have any slides today for you. I'm just going to speak freely from my heart on my experiences in dealing with these issues. It's a challenge to coordinate these issues within a community, but I believe wholeheartedly that collaboration amongst community partners is absolutely essential to success in the realm of abuse awareness and prevention. I'll just start, first of all, by giving a little bit of a background on myself. I will say, first off, that I did not go looking for this topic. This topic found me. Little did I know almost 30 years ago that what I would be dealing with as a police officer. I had some idea, but nothing could prepare me for the things that I would see. I had no idea about the human suffering and the vulnerabilities of a community, because violence was not something that was a part of my life growing up. I had no clue what I would be seeing, the injustices and the suffering of our most vulnerable in our communities. I did have extensive training at the Ontario Police College, but dealing with scenarios and mock scenarios and interacting in a fake environment was nothing that could prepare me for what I would see when I went live and I started responding to calls in our community. What I saw first and foremost was that there was a lack of collaboration in our communities. I didn't understand some of the issues that were impacting me as a police officer. I didn't understand some of the resistance that I would see in our communities, and not just from those that we are responding to, the citizens that we are there to serve and protect, but some of our supports. And there was a lot of things that could have been done differently back in those days. And I believe to this day, almost 30 years later, that had we implemented some of the strategies that are in place today, we would have been in a much better position than we are today. Although there is a notable and very vast difference between how we responded to things 30 and 40 years ago to how we respond today. And I think that the key to that is the increased education that we have. So some of the things that are important to me is to build that understanding with our other community partners. We are collectively a safety net for victims, survivors. And if there's holes in that safety net, those are gaps. The victims fall through those holes. And we're supposed to be there collectively as the police, as the criminal justice system, with our community partners, our social support services that are there to assist victims. We're supposed to hold those victims until they're able to stand for themselves and offer them support beyond that time. Breaking down some of the barriers was necessary because those barriers were the obstacles to finding solutions. And when I speak about those things, it's understanding what each other's roles and responsibilities are in our communities. And of course, some of our limitations. That was a challenge as well. I can vividly remember in my earlier days, for instance, bringing women who had been the victim of domestic violence. And in those days, we didn't understand a lot about that as police officers initially. Of course, the agencies that were funded to address these issues, they knew a whole lot about it, but we didn't understand it to the same degree. I did know one thing was for sure. I did know that I wanted to support and assist victims and be part of the solution to prevent it, but I had no idea how to do that. I didn't understand that when I brought a victim to the women's shelter for support, why I got left standing out on the porch in the cold rain and snow, why I couldn't come inside. And there were lots of reasons why. There were lots of good reasons why both myself and my male counterparts weren't able to do that, but we didn't understand why. So we felt that, those relationships were so challenging that we felt, well, they just don't like us. It's just that we're not appreciated for what we're doing. I'm here to help. And that is something that I found, in establishing trust and establishing those relationships, that it was quite the contrary. There were very good reasons why we couldn't come in, just because of the privacy of the other victims and the safety and security and trust level of those that were housed within that environment. So it was just addressing those relationships and those partnerships that really help to build those bridges and remove those gaps. As Jessica mentioned, I was a part of the establishment of community protocols, and these were critical to doing well in our communities, because we needed to understand what each other did. What is the role? Because there was a lot of overlap in services, and sometimes those relationships were difficult because there was the overlap and there was somewhat competition for funding. So as we went through the exercise of developing protocols, what is your role? What will you do? What will happen? What is your commitment if a situation occurs, what will you commit to doing? And this is an obligation that came at the highest level of each of those organizations, whether it was the executive director of the transition house, whether it was director of a child advocacy center, which, I mean, it comes in so many different forms. And as well, the detachment commanders, the chief of police, the Crown had to be involved. Every sector, it's recognizing who has a role in these issues. And you spoke to that, Jessica, earlier. It's a responsibility. It is a community responsibility. It is not something that the police can address on their own. It is not something that the social support services can address on their own, or the hospitals, or the courts, or the victim services agencies. It's collectively a responsibility of all of those agencies, but not just those that are working in that sector. This is a social responsibility that the entire community has to take on. So how do we get them to understand that there's an issue in the first place? That is one of the biggest challenges that I found throughout my career, is that the vast majority of the community did not understand the issues, and they felt that they weren't impacted. Sure, they heard about them, they listened, they read about these situations in the media, they saw various ads about these issues, but if they weren't personally affected, they didn't understand them. They didn't understand their role in the preventative aspect of it. And I can relate to that, because as I mentioned earlier, I didn't have that as part of my background. I didn't understand victimization. There was no violence in my home growing up. As I grew into an adult, I certainly had exposure through friends, through relatives, through my workplace, through my educational institutions, even within policing, that it was all around us. And I've been instructing victim issues and on all elements of abuse for my entire career, pretty much. And one of the questions I always ask to our officers when I'm delivering this training is, how many of you actually feel you are victims of the crimes you investigate? And I'll never see any hands. And I find that somewhat curious, because we are all victims of the things that happen in our community. Even if you look at the element of your presence in the community as a taxpayer, right? If the average citizen understood how much of their tax dollars was going towards responding and preventing crimes of this nature, and they are crime. Every one of them is a crime. Every form of abuse is a crime. And that building that understanding was difficult, because we're all taxpayers. So everything comes at a cost to society. The ability to facilitate this conference comes through grants that are facilitated through the ministry. So, and they're needed, and this is needed funding, but it all comes at a cost, and not just a financial cost, but if we look at the other things, the other impacts in our communities that result as because of abuse and issues that are not addressed, we will see it, and recognizing where those issues come from. So you have a lot of addiction issues, anger and addiction issues in our community. We have homelessness. We have mental health issues that we are addressing, are trying to address on a daily basis that appear to be running rampant in all of our communities. So if you have a lack of resources for those issues, and you have a lack of understanding within the community as to what is causing those issues, that is something that we need to collectively address. We need to build that understanding and have a community that takes responsibility for these issues. And so the education piece is so critical to how well we address these issues. And then we have to look at who's impacted, who are the people that are getting left behind. That's the biggest thing. I remember challenges working in the early days of protocols in the mid-90s, trying to establish wording for community protocols. And even back at that time, it was challenging to address all the needs that we as police officers had to address. For instance, we had challenges addressing the need to include wording that referred to men, so that it would be he or she or him or her within the wording of the protocols. And believe it or not, there were people that were absolutely opposed to that because that wasn't the sector in which they worked. And so, and it was an emotional issue for some that were so dedicated and so passionate to addressing the issues that they were tasked to address, that we had difficulty building that understanding that there was a bigger need than just the issue that they were addressing and the broader impact on society. We had to look at all of the issues, and some of them we didn't know. Mental health would become a much bigger focus in later years, but we had to make sure that we had everyone at the table. Those working from the mental health sector. We had to look at the issues impacting our seniors in our community, those that had different barriers, those that had disabilities. What are the barriers and what are the impacts on them as a result of those vulnerabilities? The cultural challenges, which are different because all of our communities are so culturally diverse, and the religious considerations, and some of the things that were challenging for victims who didn't have options. We had to recognize that not everybody had the same opportunities, not everybody had the same options for support that perhaps I had. And I can speak to this quite embarrassed at this stage, because I remember myself in the early days, because I did not understand this topic. I can remember speaking to victims of domestic violence, and I had no idea why they would stay within a relationship that involved violence. Why would they allow someone to be treated or to treat them in such a degrading way? Why didn't they just leave? Why weren't they taking the offer of support and assistance? Why didn't they trust me as a police officer that I was there to help them and help them end their terrible circumstances that they were in? And the answer that I came to, and it didn't take me very long to get to it, was that, Shelley, you don't have a clue what they're going through. You can't relate to them because you haven't experienced what they have experienced. You have not lacked the support that some of these people have lacked. So we had to work it. How do you reach out? How do you provide support? What is this? What is this to them? What will it take? What do they need? It was as simple as sometimes a victim of domestic violence wouldn't leave the relationship because they couldn't bring a pet to the shelter with them, and they couldn't leave the pet behind. I didn't understand those issues because for many of those victims, that was all they had left. And it seemed to me to be something that was difficult to understand, because there are other things. We could just bring the pet. Can't we get a relative to look after the pet? What could we do? We could bring them to the OSPCA. We could do something with them. Maybe there's a friend that could take the pet, but it was a challenge. Even if there were options that worked, it was a challenge because they didn't want to give that pet up. I heard many, many victims over the time of my investigation, and I spent most of my career investigating crimes of abuse or supervising those investigating or coordinating response or trying to build capacity in this space. And I had many victims say to me that it was easier to live with the abuse than live without the abuser. And once I understood what that meant, and it took many years of educating myself, understanding, working with the social sector, but most importantly, working with the people who understood the topic the best, and that was those who had been through it themselves, those who had experienced it. And there were so many diverse issues that impacted each and every one of them. Looking at, like I said, our elderly in our community, are those that were impacted by mental health, those that came from the LGBTQ2S plus communities, males within our communities. I'm going to tell you right now, they got left behind for a lot of years. And I understood this topic very well after I started to study it and I started to work in that environment and speak to those that had been impacted by those issues. I was very fortunate. I've been very fortunate to work with Abuse Hurts for many years. I think our connection started in 2004. I came to a public safety dinner and I was so impressed with the efforts that they were trying to make. I met Ellen Campbell for the first time and I said, you know what, I want to be a part of this. These people get it. They understand the gaps that we're facing and they want to work with us to address these issues. And one of the issues that I first identified as having one of the biggest gaps was the males who had been sexually or physically abused. There was nothing for them. They faced different barriers. I knew as I investigated, either it was children, male children who had been sexually abused, and they had services. There were a lot of support services that came either through the child protection services, the children's aid. They had access to counseling. But when it came to adult survivors of sexual abuse, there was nothing for them. I had many opportunities to speak to men across the province about this issue. I was fortunate enough to partner with Abuse Hurts back in, I want to say 2007. And then in 2008, I was fortunate to get a Proceeds of Crime grant that allowed me to take the messaging across the province and highlight the issue that was so under-resourced and so under-serviced. And there were so many elements of males who had experienced this that weren't being addressed because they were very different from what females were experiencing. There was stigmas attached to it. There were barriers to reporting, but worse yet, there just wasn't any services for them to go to. Some of the males were in crisis and they would try to access support. They would call the rape crisis centers and some of the sexual assault centers for assistance. And while they were very compassionate and empathetic, they had nothing to offer them. There were no support services that were specifically directed to men. The Canadian Centre for Abuse Awareness, which evolved to Abuse Hurts at that time, they knew that it was an issue. So it was a great agency to partner with to highlight these issues. They began specialized counseling, funding specialized counseling for men, which made a huge difference for the men that had the ability to access that. But I can tell you that when I went across the province, this was something that was hidden in our communities more than we had ever known. And the funny thing that I found very, none of it was funny, but the thing that I found very curious was that what happened to them when they didn't address the trauma that they had experienced? What can we do to help them get support services? And the biggest barrier was acknowledging that it was an issue. I think I read at one point, when I don't know what the statistic is now, but at one point when I was addressing this issue across the province, and I was everywhere, I went to Savannah, Georgia, to talk about this. I spoke at multiple conferences, gave training to probation and parole, correctional services, police services across the country, because no one understood this issue. Yet they were addressing the impacts in other ways. The statistic that I saw at that time was that over 85% of all long-term offenders that were currently housed in correctional institutions at that time had abuse in their childhood. And then when I looked at those statistics, I thought, you know what, let's take a look at who's in our facilities right now. What are they in there for? And a lot of it was anger-related, addiction-related crimes. And I started to look at issues differently. I started to look at homelessness differently. I knew what I thought homelessness was created by, but I didn't really understand why the population had exploded the way it did. And I understood after learning more from those impacted by it, was that mental health was a huge component, and childhood trauma was a huge component for males and for females as well. That homelessness just wasn't about teenage 15-year-olds that couldn't follow the rules at home. I started to understand that it was our youth that perhaps didn't have a home to go to or couldn't be at home because there was trauma in that home. There was abuse in that home. There was addiction in that home. There were mental health issues that created trauma, and addiction that created trauma for those people. And we had to understand their experiences. And when we looked at a lot of the homeless population that at that time, a huge number had been impacted by abuse. We had to educate. And I recall being shocked when I found, even within my own environment, my policing environment, how many of our officers had been impacted by abuse and never told anybody because of that, because of the stigma that was associated to it. I had men tell me that they've never told anybody. They haven't even told their wife about the trauma that they experienced as children. They were afraid to tell because they were afraid that their daughter wouldn't let them be around the grandchildren anymore, that they were afraid that people would look at them and as being potential abusers themselves, that their children weren't safe. And I realized that those fears were very valid, because there were perceptions in there, in a lot of people's minds, and such a lack of understanding as to what this was. The fear that the victims of these crimes would perpetrate against other children, when in fact that couldn't have been farther away from the truth. The statistics showed that there was a very small percentage who actually did offend in sexually against children, but it was about 3%. But the numbers were higher in other ways, such as domestic violence, other types of anger-related and addiction-related crimes. So we had to look at the social impact to our societies. So this is when our communities need to take responsibility, because everyone is impacted. And so while the issue of sexual violence may not have been you may not have been directly impacted, or you may not have been directly impacted by someone with addiction issues, or someone who had domestic violence in their life. It may not have personally impacted you, but it impacts your community. So when you have those impacts of trauma that isn't addressed, the support that isn't there for those people, it impacts everyone as a whole. So that's why we needed to build that understanding in the community. And so we took this road show across the province, and we ran 25 conferences in, I think, the span of 2 days, plus multiple training sessions across the country. And it was a sort of a traveling road show where victims spoke from many different avenues. One was a victim, one of the males that I had the privilege of knowing was a victim of a medical doctor who masqueraded as a basketball coach. Another was the victim of a step uncle within his family. Another was a victim of the clergy, without a lot of options to escape it, because the family was such devout Catholics, and there were deacons and nuns within their family, making it very challenging to address or speak negatively against any aspect of the clergy. And another good friend of mine, who was a retired Anishinaabe police officer, was a survivor of the residential schools. And that was an honor for me to truly understand the perspectives and what happened in their life, what changed them as a person, how were the communities impacted. And in having those 4 courageous men speak over and over and over again throughout the country, and 3 of them had the privilege through these conferences, were recognized and were called to be on Oprah Winfrey's 200 Men with Tyler Perry, addressing these issues. And then it exploded across the country, and the requests came in to speak about these issues, because the world was becoming alive to the fact that this was unresolved trauma. And also the issues as they intersect with other issues, the cultural challenges within each of these environments, and the level of support impacted everyone differently. I can recall one time in my own environment, those that you would have no clue that they had experienced any of this. We ran a conference in Thunder Bay, and 2 officers came from the north, and they actually drove there together. And we presented the information at the first morning break. One of those officers came up and said, I've never told anybody, but I've been abused. I was abused sexually as a child. Wouldn't you know, at the lunch break, the other officer came up and said, I've been abused. I didn't know what to do with it. I've never told anyone. And that's when it struck me that these two officers traveled 3 hours to get to this conference in the same police vehicle, and they couldn't talk to each other because they were isolated in their circumstances. So how can we fix that? How can we make it better? How can we address this and make sure that we understand the situation so that we can provide those resources? The other issues that I found were challenging as well is not only getting the communities to understand the issues, but getting our social support agencies, getting the police services to understand that we had a problem. Jessica mentioned that I had spearheaded a campaign back in 2001 to develop the Sunrise Center. And I remember, I can remember this to this day. I approached it at one of we had a joint sexual assault and domestic violence advisory committee for the community that we met every other month. And it involved all of the players. And this is critical. Everyone needs to have a seat at the table. And we have to recognize who has a piece in this and who has a responsibility. And that included the school boards, that included the hospitals, the courts, the Crown's office, the police, all of the wide array of victim support agencies. And that is something that we really needed to figure out. But I remember sitting at the table and I said, I would like our community to develop a care and treatment center for victims of domestic violence and sexual violence at our local hospital. And at this time, our local hospital was in Orangeville. It was a Headwaters Healthcare Center. It was it was fairly new hospital at the time. And it serviced a huge catchment area. And I was shocked that not only did my fellow police colleagues from 2 other police services and another OPP detachment turn me down flat. And not just the police, but the Crown, the victim services agencies, the shelters, the sexual assault advocacy centers said it's not needed. We have those services. I couldn't believe it because I knew that they were up and running in some of the larger centers. And I didn't know much about them, but I wanted the same for the survivors in our community. I knew that we had to reach out in a better way because we weren't I knew that what was reported to the police was just a small snippet of what was actually out there. So they turned me down flat and I said, okay, well, will you give me this? At least let me come back and I can speak to this again. Can I come back at the next meeting and do a full presentation to try to change your mind? Because anybody who knows me knows that I don't take no for an answer, not very well. People chuckle. My old manager said to me, "Oh, Shelly, you're not going to let this go, are you?" I said, "Nope. It's needed, and we have to do something about it." And I just now, if I know it's the right thing to do, and it's a needed resource, no just means I have to go about this a different way. It's to me, no is the first stepping stone on the path to yes. And I did that. I've done that continually throughout my career because we have to continue to forge ahead and do the right things, even if not everyone understands that. And we build that understanding and then we get to where we need to be. So I went back and I went across the province to the few places that happen to have a sexual assault and domestic violence specialized services within hospitals. And I learned and I heard from those that had been impacted by the services, who had benefited from the services. And I put together a presentation and I came back And I said, it is needed. What's the harm? And I think that, again, this overlap of some services was the issue. And I couldn't understand to myself, why wouldn't they want someone to have? All I'm asking for is, I want victims who have been violated in the worst possible way. I want them to be able to bypass triage in their hospital. I want them not to have to sit in the waiting room amongst their neighbors, because that is a barrier. They're embarrassed, they're humiliated by what they've experienced. They don't want their neighbors to know. They don't want their family to know. They don't want anyone to know. So how, if they don't want anyone to know, will they reach out and be supported if they don't tell anyone? If they don't know there's anywhere to go that will be compassionate and understanding for what they're experiencing? All I want is them to come and have specialized treatment by people who have the competency and the compassion to respond to them in an effective way that will actually be the first part of the safety net, that will be the first stepping stone to their healing path. And I don't want them to have to be loaded up after they go to the sterile environment of the hospital. I want them to be in a comfortable, relaxed environment where they can come in and be treated medically and followed up by an interview in the same environment, so that we don't have to do invasive examination of them for forensic evidence and then have to haul them off in the backseat of a cruiser to the police station after that to be interviewed, and then have victim services come in as a separate entity. We want them to have all of those supports in one place. Why are they opposed to this? And so I didn't let it go. The other person was a very lovely woman by the name of Ronnie Ingalls, and she was a sexual assault nurse examiner at the Headwaters Healthcare Center at the time. And she, some of you on the call may remember her. She was a wonderful woman, long retired now. She was the only other one to support it. So Ronnie and I kind of ganged up on the rest of the committee, and we convinced them that this was needed. I said, Ronnie, find me space. How can we do this? How can we get this? She found a place that could be expanded off the ambulance bay, where victims of sexual assault and domestic violence could come in through a garden pathway, totally avoiding the emergency room entrance, and that they could come in and be dealt with by people who understood the topic. And then I started to reach out to the community. And I found there actually was a lot of support. The community wanted to be a part of this for their community. The Rotarians committed funds, local contractors committed to doing the work pro bono, community businesses donated to the cause. And then it took us a while, because that first introduction was in 2001, but in May of 2004, we opened the door to victims at the Headwaters Healthcare Center, and little, much to the surprise of the naysayers, we had a 38% increase in reported sexual assault alone in the first 6 months we opened the door. And we had done a media release on it. I mean, social media wasn't what it is today, but we splashed it all over the media. And we also did that for other things that we were doing in the community to identify needs, working across the province to bring soft interview rooms to communities, so that those that had been victimized by these horrendous crimes had a better place to go. They weren't being interviewed in the same rooms where offenders were being interrogated. And through all of that, we did one actually up in Rama First Nation, and it was really amazing to see how many people reached out. The room, and I won't even try, because I know I'll get it I'll mispronounce it terribly, but the English translation from the Ojibwe name was Safe Talking Place. And I remember when we did the media release up there and the first victims started coming in, they were so appreciative of having this place to come that was safe, that was trusted. But more importantly, when you announce this to your community, what you're really saying is, I see you. I see you. Because we were acknowledging that there were victims out in our communities that felt isolated. They felt alone. They didn't know that there were others that had suffered. They didn't know that the police and the social services within the community and the victim response agencies knew about what they were experiencing. They didn't know that they had a place to go. And that was our role, was to tell them, to let them know that we have something for you. We have a place that you can come where you're not going to be judged. You're going to be received, and you're going to receive compassionate understanding, even from the police, and the way that we recognize these crimes exist. And building that trust was the key to addressing issues primarily for victims who were fearful to report their crimes. So that was very important, particularly in the police sector, because I think that the agencies within our community that have done a wonderful job, and of every element, they have always been perceived as being helpers. But in the realm of abuse and being judged, and some of the prosecutions that have been difficult over the years, I don't know that the police had that same understanding. So we had to change that. We had to build trust and work with our partners. Human trafficking was another issue, and I'll highlight that. I can recall when I was the lead in human trafficking starting in 2012, it was extremely difficult to even convince the community that there was an issue, because there was a terrible lack of understanding of what the sex trade was. That there were in fact some sex trade workers that were not there voluntarily. Some were, but there were a lot that weren't. And a horrible misunderstanding regarding prostitution. And so building that understanding, even within my own police service, to say we have a need to address these issues. Well, Shelley, where are the stats? We can't fund specialized units. We have no cases to show that we actually need it. And so what I had to do was convince them that when you go looking for these hidden issues in your community, and you work with your partners and you take the information that you're receiving, because some will go to the police and won't go to a community resource. So it's up to the community or the police to connect to the community resources, but we have to understand what those resources are. But a lot of victims will go to the community resources, but they won't go to the police. So how can we build those partnerships to be able to collaborate, make those referrals? And I remember with human trafficking, it was very easy actually, because the OPP started working with other police agencies on something called Operation Northern Spotlight, where they were reaching out to and responding to ads for sexual services, but only it was an undercover police officer that would go in with victim support from the human trafficking sector, and would offer resources. And it was reaching out in that way. Are you okay? Do you need help? Can we support you? Here we are if you need help, making those connections. And some would be rescued, some would not. Some wouldn't be rescued for a long time and wouldn't reach out for the support, but we were reaching out to them. We weren't leaving it up to them to identify what the needs were, because we didn't have an opportunity. I'm going to move into questions very shortly, but one of the things that I'll end with is the fact that you need to take your seat at the table. And if there's no table, make a table. Pull up to the table and take your seat, even if you're not invited, because it's everyone's responsibility to address these issues. So if you see a place, and there is a place, find your seat and take the rightful seat and commit to doing what's right and forging ahead, even when you're not getting the responses that you think you should be getting. Build that understanding with the partners in your community, because you will have good results. Through my experiences now, I partnered with agencies I never thought I would. I partnered and I learned from those survivors. Those are the best partners you can ever have, because they're going to tell you flat out what they need. They are important voices at the table. They will educate you. Like I said, I didn't have a clue back when I first started this, and now I'll be ending. I'm planning to retire next year, and I'll still stay and volunteer within the realm of this sector because it's important to me and it's my responsibility as a citizen first and foremost. And than it is as my as a police officer. But in saying that, I will say that it has been an absolute privilege to be trusted with these important topics by the citizens of this province, because if someone allows you into this space, into their most vulnerable aspects of their life, it is a privilege. And it's not something to be taken lightly. So with that, I'm going to say thank you very much for allowing me this space to speak about my personal experiences. I'm proud of what I've done over 30 years. It hasn't been easy, and I won't say that it wasn't without mistakes, lots of them, but I learned from them and I try to do better every day. And I know that I have to be one of the voices to speak for those that have not yet found their voice, and for those that have had their voices silenced. We have to all be advocates for those people, because once we do, we bring strength and hope to those survivors, and they're able to, in many respects, they find the strength within themselves with support that you bring to them. So thank you, and I'll open it up for any questions you may have.
Thank you very much, Shelley. That was tremendous and very eye-opening, even to hear the journey that you had to forge ahead in. And that was a very encouraging angle to bring forward, is that this is a hard topic, and it still amazes me that there are many groups within our very own communities that struggle to find the relevance in and the need to serve the vulnerable sector and to actually gain more awareness of what is happening. And so I thank you for the exhortation to make the place at the table, to have the voice that is needed, and to forge ahead. It is certainly something that we can't do alone, but with more people like yourself encouraging us, who've gone before us, to lead the way, it makes a way for others to follow behind and to carry on your legacy, which is something that we all as a community want to do. One of the questions that I have, and I'd like to just encourage the audience to get involved. Please pop your questions into the Q&A button at the bottom of this display window. You'll see it there. I will be able to see your questions. We can ask Shelley. We have her here for a few more moments, and it would be wonderful to engage her excellence and her expertise. It's not often that we have these times available to share. So please, I encourage you, get your questions up there. Think of things that if she was sitting in your living room, what would you want to ask her? And Shelley, this is one of the things that you've touched on in different places. And I really like the way you opened the session with saying, you know, this topic found me. And clearly it has connected with something deep inside you that was relentless, and you refused to let it go, no matter how many people opposed you or said no. And you were just like, I don't understand how people could not. But tell us a little bit about how you are able to do what you do and how you are still thriving and not just surviving, but able to still instill hope and create opportunity for others in such a very difficult type of environment. What does that look like, and how do you keep yourself well in the midst of it all?
So that's a good, it's a good question. And it's one that I've been asked a lot over my career. I've had colleagues that haven't specialized in this work and just said, Shelley, I don't know how you can do this work. How can you do it? And usually I say, well, how can I not? Really, that's the question back to you. How can I, somebody has to do it. Somebody has to be there for these vulnerable victims of these horrendous crimes. And I have had the privilege of working with some amazing, dedicated people who have been across this province. I've sat on advisories with representatives from many police sectors and across the world, really, and as well our victim support agencies in so many different elements. And I use that because there's so many different aspects of that. It's challenging. It did have an impact on me. I'm not going to say it did not. I can recall when my own children started to become of age, of the vast majority of the children I was dealing with in my investigations. It had an impact on me. I can tell you, my children, there were certain things my children didn't get to do because I didn't have those, blinders on. I knew too much about what was out there. I can tell you, my children, I didn't even want them sitting on Santa Claus's knee without me standing right there because of the things that I'd seen, the negative side of life. My children would never be put on one of those ponies at a traveling fair. They were never Boy Scouts. They would never be altar boys. I wasn't terribly involved in the church, but there was no way that was ever happening. And it was because I knew the negative elements of it. I remember one day feeling impacted. My son, my oldest son, he's 23 now. And I held him one day. He came and he ran up to me and I held him. And all of a sudden he became like a hot potato. I felt my hand became very present. I was holding him under his bottom. And I remember all of a sudden, instead of what should have been a very tender moment with my son, became something that was very sort of perverse. Like it was negative to me because of where my hand was. There was no other place to hold him, but it became all of a sudden something that wasn't good. And that's when I knew I sort of had to take a step back. I had to do things a little bit different. I had to get some breathing space and come back to this topic. It's a challenge talking to my children, educating on the various elements of it. Most people don't hear the things that we hear. We don't hear the terminology. They don't hear the terminology that I heard as an investigator. And educating our public to be aware, our children. That impacted how I educated my own children, but educating others on the things that you need to do so that they are free to speak in this space about things that are negative. Because if we don't understand and we don't think we're allowed to talk about these topics, if every time we hear something that would not be considered appropriate, we turned off the radio, we turned off the TV, all we do is tell our children, you're not allowed to talk about these things. We don't want you involved. So if something negative happens, you don't feel you're allowed to talk about it. So just changing our mindset and helping along the way. So thank you.
Excellent. Thank you so much for being willing to share that, and even, offering some vulnerability amongst yourself with your own family experiences. And certainly that does shed light to other professionals in the field, also survivors who have been through this route, and the awareness that we all have once our life has been impacted, whether that's through learning or firsthand experience. Linda Harlos wants to thank you for being willing to continue to fight even after you retire, which I understand is something that you're approaching fairly soon. And certainly we will all be at a loss for the impact that you've been able to make in these areas, but we are confident that this passion isn't going anywhere, and that awareness for abuse prevention will continue. And we all are excited to stay in touch and to endeavor together beyond this. A couple of other questions. What is the biggest hurdle that you think we are facing now, and how is it that we can help? This is everybody's responsibility. Obviously, we play different roles, but what would you say from the macro perspective could be an issue that we really do need to tackle, and how?
I would say the infrastructure. There has to be a complete infrastructure. It's not one sector that can do something on their own. Everything has to be in place. It's all elements of response that have to work together. You have to know what those services are available, what each sector does. And you stick to what you're supposed to do, and you allow and you refer and you work collaboratively together to build that trust so that it is a seamless process. That I still see gaps in our services for that. And I still see elements where that survivors slip through the cracks because it isn't a seamless approach. Collaborate with your community. Build that community mobilization is so important, and that responsibility. Take your place, agree and commit to what you're going to do. Reach out to build that. Reach out to those other sectors. Build that networking. And it's not a one-shot deal. Do it and keep doing it. Do it regularly and build those relationships, because just in my sector, people move. I had a great relationship with someone from that agency and they've gone now. Well, you need to build another great relationship with whoever's there now. And it's a continual process. So keep coming to the table, keep talking about these issues, and keep inviting the right people. And that includes those that are impacted most by it, the ones that have experienced the abuse.
Excellent. I really appreciate what you say about the keep doing it, stay consistent, reach out. Great achievements often don't happen, like you said, in a one-shot deal. It is that consistent habit that leads to change and to the overcoming strategies that we really do want to see. A couple of our attendees are asking if there is a specific book, a specific piece of literature or research material that you may recommend for any of us who really want to learn more or delve deeper into a particular topic.
There's lots. Rebuilding your house of self-respect is a great resource to understanding males who are victimized. Doing as much research as you can. I have lots of books, and of course, I can't think of all the names. That one I facilitated for so long and included it as part of my conference. But yes. just research. Google up the topics, see what resources are available. Feel free to connect with me. I'm more than happy to connect with anyone to give some resources that I've had. Read, learn, speak, talk about it, and you'll build that understanding.
Wonderful, excellent. Well, we are almost finished. Another participant, Malik Fernando, has thanked you again for your continuing work and your dedication. The Abuse Hurts has free copies of Building Your House of Self-Respect, the book you mentioned. So please feel free to reach out to the booth. And that concludes our session. Thank you very much, everybody. And we will see you back here at 10 a.m. for our next session.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Are you there? Shelly, are you there?
I am here.
Okay, wonderful. That was very good. That was so close. I think we just came in right on time.
I saw, I was watching the clock. I'm saying it's 9:44. It's going to cut me off.
Your timing was excellent. Thank you so much. That was tremendous.
What you wanted in an effective way.
Yes. And so, you know, the thing that kept coming up for me over and over again was simply that there was so much lack of awareness, even amongst the professional groups. And that's just continuing to stand out, no matter how many